This week on Worldview, we're going to look at the government's great vaccine hunt and other areas where there's been a major shift in the focus of diplomacy. We're calling it COVID diplomacy 2.0.
And External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar is on a 5-day visit to the United States.
The national society, this term, the world is a family, is very deeply embedded in Indian thinking.
Now, since the second wave of the COVID pandemic in India, India's diplomatic service has clearly had to shift course. If in 2020 it was occupied with bringing in Indians who had been stranded in the lockdown, what was called Vande Bharat mission, or it was about the export of vaccines eventually to 95 countries, what was called Vaccine Maitri. In 2021, particularly after April, the diplomatic services tasks have really changed to 3 major priorities. The hunt for vaccines, limiting the damage from its decision to end the export of vaccines, as well as from multilateral diplomacy. So we're going to take a look at each of these 3 points one by one. The first is the hunt for vaccines, but obviously in the immediate time of the pandemic, we saw that the diplomats as well as the missions abroad were looking for oxygen containers. They were looking really for medicines that were specifically needed, what are called therapeutics. But now with numbers coming down, it is clear that the Ministry of External Affairs as well as all the missions abroad are quite focused on bringing in as many vaccines as possible. It's unclear just how unrealistic or realistic the government's goals are, but the government has now announced that it plans to vaccinate a substantial part of India's adult population by the end of 2021, by December. That would mean about 1 billion people or 2 billion doses of vaccines are needed over the next 6 months. Now, a large part of these are expected to come from the domestic manufacture of Covishield, of Covaxin. This is by Serum Institute, as well as Bharat Biotech, as well as possibly from the Russian-made Sputnik that could begin production in August. So what else are India's diplomats working on? Obviously, there is the United States. It has 3 major manufacturers, Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. Negotiations have been underway with them for some months. But the problem is that they have been holding out on certain demands, and the government will really have to give in on these demands if it would seem to make some progress. And this is an area where India's diplomats, led by Dr. Jaishankar, have been working. What are these demands? Indemnity. These vaccine manufacturers want a waiver of liability in case there are any adverse incidents. The second is what is called pre-supply emergency use authorization. So there must be an authorization or clearances for these vaccines before they are actually supplied to India. A centralized purchasing, so no state-by-state mechanism, and they want to advance upfront payments. Now, there are other areas where there have been negotiations with the US, most recently on the stockpile that the US has. They have about 60 million AstraZeneca doses. They have about 25 million other vaccines that they don't need at present. During Dr. Jaishankar's visit to the US, he raised these concerns. And then in a call this week on Thursday, US Vice President Kamala Harris spoke to Prime Minister Modi and to other countries to discuss the details of how the US will actually distribute its spare vaccines. They'll start in June and then they'll free up more after July. Now, the stockpile itself is of about 25 million vaccines, as I said, and they have promised about 7 million to 15 Asian nations, including India. Clearly, that's not a lot, but it is all part of the efforts that we are seeing by the government over the past few weeks. India has also wanted the US to open up the export of vaccine ingredients, which have been restricted by the US's own Defense Production Act. After the visit and the talks that we have seen, the US has agreed to allow certain vaccine ingredients for companies that are producing the AstraZeneca vaccine and some others, but not for the Indian-made vaccines just yet. And remember, while India has procured vaccine deals with Europe, with Russia, and the US, for obvious political reasons, tensions at the line of actual control, bilateral tensions with China, it has not opened any conversations with China for the use of its WHO approved Sinovac or Sinopharm vaccines. So let's look at the second point, and this is where diplomats really have their work cut out, which is limiting the damage that has been done because of the decision to end vaccine exports as they did. At the height of the second wave, it seemed only natural that India would stop its vaccine exports, given the need within. But this has had international repercussions, and that's something that they will have to look at more closely. Remember, between January and April this year, India exported more than 66 million vaccine doses to 95 countries, of which 11 million were grants from India, 35 million were commercial exports, and 20 million or so were part of the COVAX coalition commitments. However, Indian manufacturers still have many more pending orders, some of which were part of the COVAX commitments to less developed nations, the smaller islands, Africa, South America, but others were to the neighborhood, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, the rest all had fully paid up orders. So what is going to be the impact and the challenge really for India's diplomats? The first is dealing with the disappointment in India and possibly a loss of trust in giving Indian companies future orders for vaccines. The second is a loss of influence, particularly in the subcontinent, in the SAARC region, where India was seen as the biggest vaccine provider. Today, instead, China has shipped supplies to all Indian neighbors other than Bhutan. And now the US has also promised to send its surplus stock to every country in the region. It might send AstraZeneca later to Bhutan as well. Now, Bhutan is a particularly difficult situation, so I want to take a minute over it because Bhutan was entirely dependent on India to start with. It has no diplomatic relations with any of the Security Council countries, permanent countries, so no diplomatic ties with the US, Russia, or China, which have vaccine manufacturers. In fact, India had promised to take care of Bhutan's vaccination needs, provided the first tranche of 550,000 doses. Remember, Bhutan has about 536,000 eligible adults for the vaccine. India promised the second but never delivered. And time is now running out because Bhutan vaccinated its entire population within 10 days at the end of March. It now needs to do the same thing for the second dose by the end of June. So time is running out. And the last point being that India's loss will clearly be the gain of other vaccine manufacturing countries, and it will fall really to India's diplomats to pick up the pieces of the fallout and to ensure that they make amends with each of the countries for that supply chain being truncated very abruptly. Now, the third part of India's diplomatic challenges are the multilateral challenges. So let's just take a look at all of those. There is, of course, the World Trade Organization proposal, where India and South Africa proposed on October 2nd, 2020, asking that for a period of 3 years, all patents and intellectual properties be waived by all countries. This is something that the US promised to support now after a lot of diplomacy. And then this week, India chaired a meeting of BRICS ministers that included China, interestingly, which agreed for the first time to support a WTO proposal, not necessarily the India-South Africa one, for a waiver of intellectual property rights on all vaccines for the COVID pandemic. Prime Minister Modi also tried to pitch the WTO initiative with the European Union. This didn't do as well when he met with 27 EU leaders in early May. But in the next few months, we will see how it goes, who signs on to it. Remember, WTO works by consensus. So everyone will need to be on board for this proposal to go through, and then for countries like India to be able to benefit and produce more vaccines. The next point that India's multilateral diplomacy will entail is more investigations into the origins of the virus. Last week, and you can find that video both on www.thehindu.com as well as YouTube, we dealt at length with the theories of the origin of the virus, especially the lab leak theory, the question of did China cover up a laboratory accident or leak or otherwise, which led to the spread of this very, very infectious virus. Are the US and other countries also involved in similar research in funding what was called the gain of function research that manipulates viruses? India, that has faced the brunt of this pandemic, has now begun to speak out for the need for a full investigation into the origins of the virus. And the MEA has actually made 3 statements over the course of the last month after remaining relatively silent. And finally, India will be looking at how to revamp the Universal Bio-Warfare Convention. As a member of the UN Security Council for the next 2 years, as well as the executive board member at the World Health Organization, India will be at the forefront of demanding a review of the Bioweapons Convention of 1972. Remember, it's formally known as the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling of Bacteriological, or what are called biological and toxin weapons, as well as on their destruction. Now, this convention actually lacks teeth at present. It does not have a compliance mechanism. It does not have a body that can ensure compliance, and it needs to be upgraded 50 years later, especially at a time when the world is alive to the dangers of a fast-spreading virus. India really could regain some of its footing in the world by taking a leadership position on preventing the next pandemic. Remember, 18 months in, we already have 3 million people dead globally. So I have a few more book recommendations since last week. We gave you some last week as well on looking at the origins of the virus and other things. This week we're going to look a little bit at books on the development of vaccines themselves. And there are 2 books. Vaccine, The Controversial Story of Medicine's Greatest Lifesaver by Arthur Allen, as well as Paul Offit's The Cutter Incident. They're really looking closely at the development of the polio vaccine, but many lessons to be learned over here. There are also several books on biological research, warfare. One that's coming up on all the conspiracy theories put together is called What Really Happened in Wuhan, The Cover-Ups, The Conspiracies and the Classified Research by Shari Markson. She is an investigative journalist. Of course, the book is already very controversial. It's come in for criticism, not the least from Chinese scientists as well, but it might be an interesting read later this year. That's all we have time for here on Worldview, but do keep joining us and from the team here. Thanks for watching.